So, hi everyone, welcome to the last workshop of the Science Communication Toolbox for Researchers program. If you're joining us for the very first time, this has been a 7-workshop long series to teach different skills in science communication. And to begin, I do want to acknowledge where I'm tuning in from. So I'm tuning in from the Greater Toronto Area region, which is home to many different Indigenous groups. Specifically, I'm located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the Wendat peoples. As always, please do make sure that you know which territories you're currently living and working upon, and you can find out more by checking out Whose Land and nativeland.ca. So we've been through 7 workshops. We started off with Science Communication 101, then we explored social media as a form to communicate science before thinking more broadly about public engagement. We then took a turn into visual science communication with Julia Krolick, and then Community Engagement 101 with 3 different speakers. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Wikipedia editing, and today we're here at our last workshop called Science Policy 101. In this workshop, you're going to hear from 2 speakers. There's me, and then there's also Jessie Ejai. This workshop, you're going to learn about the Canadian science policy landscape and discover how science can contribute to decision-making processes. You're going to explore different policy communication tools, and we're specifically going to work on an activity where we'll be thinking about one specific issue and how you can address it. Jessie is going to give us a very specific example of policy making, specifically as it relates to land development and land planning. And to start off, I wanted to ask a question, which was, what is science policy? I'm going to drop a link in the chat. Think about what is science policy and how would you define it, or what do you think science policy includes? Shirley's put in the chat the allocation of resources for science research for the greater good of the public. So the first one says making governance decisions using scientific evidence. Then there's trying to improve policies based on evidence from science and research. There's rules and regulations applied in the scientific environment to achieve the scientific goals. There's legislative decisions and actions that revolve around science, or at least have a scientific component where that knowledge can be a useful part of decision-making process. There's integrating science into the public decision-making process. There's a coordinated approach to promote scientific and/or technological research, specifically in the case of being supported by government. And there's using science-based evidence to write policies. So you might have noticed that there are 2 trends. There's this idea of science being used for policy, and then this idea of policy being used for science. A lot of people, the way when we think about science policies, we actually break it into 2 parts. There's science for policy and policy for science. So this idea of policy for science is policies that are related to managing and supporting science infrastructure. And this can involve a lot of different things. It can involve perhaps thinking about how best to structure science, how best to fund science, how do we enable collaborations, open science, open access or open science initiatives, or how do we enable interdisciplinary collaborations both at the regional, national, and international level. It's all about using policy to help science function. But on the flip side, there's also science for policy. So this is about how science can play a role in policy processes or decision-making processes. And this can involve science advice, it can involve introducing regulations, and we've seen it a lot, or haven't seen a lot of it during the pandemic response. So kind of seeing how real-time scientific evidence, whether that's COVID-19 testing data or public health advice, and how it plays into policy decisions. And a lot of people picture this as a science policy interface. So this idea that science policy is a social process which involves relations between scientists and other key policy actors in this policy process. And it allows for exchanges, it allows for co-evolution and joint construction of knowledge with the aim of enriching decision making. I'm going to focus on this idea further, and I want to look at it from organizations who are involved in science policy, as well as individuals and key actors who are involved in this interface. So when we're thinking of organizations involved in the science policy interface, There are many. There can be nonprofits, there can be think tanks, there can be societies, there can be universities who might be lobbying, there are branches of government, and then there are funding agencies too. I'm going to focus on the branches of government and the funding agencies as they're important and probably very related to the issues that you might be thinking of today. So when it comes to branches of government here in Canada, there are three. You've got the federal branch of government, the federal level, where people who serve in the federal branch of government are members of parliament. So these are individuals who will run in one of the many ridings here in Canada. You have your elections every 4 years. And once elected, the members of parliament represent their riding, their constituents, and they may take on roles such as minister roles, and they are people you can reach out to and have a conversation and advocate for an issue that you care about. Then there's also provincial and territorial branches of government. So we have 10 provinces and 3 territories here in Canada. And you have members of legislative assembly who are the representatives at this branch. This is also referred to as the members of provincial parliament or members of House of Assembly or MNA, I think, members of National Assembly. And these are the folks who represent you at the provincial level. So here in Ontario, we've got MPPs who sit at Queen's Park, and it's different for every province. You'll find that there are some shared responsibilities between the provincial and federal level. So at the federal level, that's where decisions about research, about funding for research will be made. At a provincial and territorial level, that's where decisions about education will be made. Then there's municipal, so at a very local level, you'll find that there are mayors and councillors. And even though I've kind of shown them as 3 separate branches, there's a lot of interplay. So provincial and territorial and federal, you've seen a lot of collaborations happening, especially in the past year when it comes to coordinating different aspects of kind of vaccine logistics or vaccine delivery. Natural resources, another one that's shared. And the environment too, as you can see kind of with the carbon tax and different aspects of the climate emergency. So even though these branches of government are very separate, there's still a lot of collaboration happening. Another few relevant organizations when it comes to the science policy interface are the federal funding agencies, as well as federal agencies and departments. So federal funding agencies, probably the easiest one to recognize for a lot of people here is NSERC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. You might recognize it because that's the first word of this network's name, NSERC PermafrostNet. There's also SSHRC, so Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, who fund more social sciences and humanities research. And then there's CIHR, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research, so health-related research. These are the agencies who are responsible for holding competitions to decide who to fund. They are doing a lot of the work when it comes to deciding who to fund, tracking EDI-related outcomes, and when people are upset about kind of funding and talking about how much money goes into science, these are the folks who distribute it, but they don't get to decide kind of how much money is allocated. Then there are federal agencies and departments. I've highlighted a few, but there are many. There's Natural Resources of Canada, there's the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and then there are different departments like Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Health Canada, Transport Canada, and so on. So Natural Resources of Canada, they have sectors such as forestry, minerals, oil, so a lot of it might be relevant to a lot of people in the network. There's the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, so they're responsible for carrying out impact assessments. Whenever there's a project which impacts federal lands and it might have any potential environmental, social, health related effects, that project must be assessed, and that happens through this agency. And then you've got other departments like Fisheries and Health Canada who have their own specific mandates. I could go on. I've only flagged a few of the relevant organizations, but it kind of gets you thinking about this whole picture of just how many different organizations are involved. Like I haven't even touched on think tanks or universities yet, who all have different issues that they are speaking up about or advocating about. And just as importantly, there are different actors and roles within the science policy interface. I've pulled out kind of 4 idealistic categories from this book called The Honest Broker. Again, this is very idealistic, but one of the roles that they've pulled out is this idea of a pure scientist, so someone who is doing their research, they are carrying out science, they're publishing in journals, and that's kind of their contribution to the science policy interface. It's the output that they're producing, which could be used by decision makers. Then there are science arbiters and issue advocates. So, issue advocates would be someone who has an issue that they care deeply about, and they're going to advocate for their particular solution or their particular issue. And then there's also the honest broker. So, this is someone who kind of takes a look at all of the evidence that's available and kind of makes that best decision that's possible based on that situation. So, that would be someone like a policy analyst. This is a very idealistic view of the roles in the science policy interface, so I wanted to give you a few examples of what this can look like in real life. So currently, for example, here are three key actors in Canada's science policy landscape. There is the Honorable Francois-Philippe Champagne, who is the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. So a lot of the organizations that I point out, for example, NSERC, SSHRC, Natural Resources Canada, they do fall under this innovation, science, and industry portfolio. There is Dr. Mona Nemer, who is Canada's Chief Science Advisor. She provides scientific advice to the federal government, and she does report to the Honorable Francois-Philippe Champagne, as well as the Prime Minister of Canada, and anyone who really requests that advice. And there's also actors at kind of the provincial level. So, for example, there is Dr. Rémi Guérin, who is the Chief Scientist of Quebec, and you also have Chief Scientists across other regions here in Canada. There are also departmental science advisors, so chief scientists who are embedded in different federal departments. Not every role is science related, so within departments you have a deputy minister, an assistant deputy minister, you can go down to policy analysts, and these are people who might be serving as either honest brokers or science arbiters who are using science as one of their inputs into the decision-making process. And just as importantly, there are trainees, researchers, scientists who might be advocating, who might be in these roles themselves, or who might just be speaking up about an issue from the outside, and so many more. So, taking it all together, we now have a better idea of who's involved in science policy and what science policy can look like. And I wanted to ask the question to all of you, which is, how does science communication differ when it comes to policymakers? So for some context, we've talked about a lot of different types of science communication over the past few workshops. We've talked about using social media, using visual science communication. And even though a lot of the concepts are the same, I'm curious to hear how you think that science communication would differ when you're interacting with policymakers. So we have one comment that says, I imagine it would be a more formal process. So I'm going to read off these comments, but I'm not going to tell you the answer yet. So the first one is, I imagine it to be a more formal process. It needs to be short and get straight to the point. Communications needs to be more action-based with justifications for why these policies should be in place. It is formal and needs to be approved before sharing. The language and content has to be generalized to be more digestible. A set of policies to protect the project and who is involved based on the communication agreed upon. And the last one is, it is more subjective. So those are all very interesting. I'm going to take a few slides now to talk about what we know about decision making. So, a very idealistic view about decision making is this idea that you can publish your science, you can publish your research, and now that that information is out there, a decision maker will read it and think about it, consider it, and use that to make a policy decision. But as you can imagine, it is not that straightforward. Firstly, you can kind of start off with this idea that not all of science is accessible. It's in technical jargon. It's published behind paywalls. It's hard to know where to search for this information. Especially, it's hard enough as a scientist. It's harder as someone who hasn't been trained in science, who doesn't know how to navigate these processes. So, and another thing to keep in mind is that science is not the only input in decision making. So science doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are so many other factors to consider when it comes to decision making, including economic aspects, legal aspects, health aspects, social aspects, and so much more. And these are all factors that decision makers have to consider when they're making that decision. And it's not just one decision each time. That decision might change over time as new evidence comes in, as circumstances change. Two models that Gordard has presented in this 2016 paper is that even when making a decision, you have to consider kind of the available knowledge, the values of that person or the values of that government in question, and then the rules, so what's permissible and what isn't. And that's what leads you to a decision. Or another way of looking at it is kind of it's the interplay of values, knowledge, and rules, which tells you what solutions are possible and helps you kind of narrow down on that decision making model. I'm going to focus on the knowledge parts, and that's going to be interesting. And it's this idea of, all right, so the science that is used in decision making, how do decision makers view this? How do they incorporate this into their decision making? And for this, I'm going to pull on the study that was carried out by Evidence for Democracy. So in 2019, Evidence for Democracy, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit, you'd think that I would know this. Full disclosure, I do work at Evidence for Democracy now, and I was not involved in the study. They carried out a series of one-on-one interviews to understand how members of parliament, so people at the federal level of the government, use research and evidence in their work. They interviewed a number of MPs, and they were really trying to figure out how do MPs gather and use information when it comes to decision making. So in this first figure here, you see how members of parliament gather information. And there's a lot of variability. Some of the most common resource is actually the Library of Parliament, so they can request the Library of Parliament to gather and provide information. Other sources of information include external organizations, constituents, so people in their riding that they represent. This is followed by news and mainstream media or talking directly to experts. And then, kind of in third place, you see Google, you see trusted contacts, you see other people in the government, other MPs. And as we kind of keep trailing on downwards, you can see that committees are a source of information. And then you see scientific literature. So about 6 MPs say that they use scientific literature. And then there's also the Research Bureau, industry, social media, public forums, and town halls. I will flag though, even though we're talking about members of parliament, it's important to remember that members of parliament are supported by staffers in their office. So it's not the MPs always directly looking for information, but also their staff. But yeah, from just this question alone, you can see just how much variability there is in the information that members of parliament consider when making a decision. However, all of them did say that making sure that the information was credible and relevant was a key factor. And even though credibility was a valuable factor, how members of parliament evaluated this credibility varied. So almost all of them did check the source to confirm if it was credible. They had a bit of a gut check, so like, does this make sense? A couple of them did check if it was peer reviewed, and other options include checking with trusted sources, checking if the information was repeated elsewhere, and the last option was consider who funded the work, and that was only pointed out by 5 members of parliament. Two more things that I wanted to flag was an important question is, what do MPs define as research? And a lot of interesting characteristics came out. So one of them was that the information was collected rigorously or it came from a reputable source. Peer reviewed was pointed out by 8 members of parliament. And then others pointed out that research includes work that's done through committees. It includes statistics. It might be from the Library of Parliament, Research Bureau, talking to community. So it's really interesting that there's no shared definition of research among the members of parliament who were interviewed for this study, and that research really means different things to different folks who are working at this federal level. And as for challenges of what the challenges that members of parliament face when they're trying to use science and evidence at work, a lot of different comments came out. So the most important one that was flagged was bias or spin. So members of parliament found that it was hard to figure out whether there was any bias involved in the information source they were using. There's also the issue of information overload, which imagine is much worse today given our increasingly virtual world. So this idea that there are so many different sources that the members of parliament could use that they're unsure on how to navigate that. Time is, of course, a limiting factor. Then there's conflicting findings just between research sources. Others include that politics isn't just based on evidence, so this idea that science does not exist in a vacuum. Other reasons that members of parliament pointed out was that they can't be an expert in everything, that they don't have enough funds, that constituent needs or feelings sometimes contradict the science, that scientists are worried about disclosing information, and that information is behind paywalls. There's not enough research on what they actually need. It's hard to find experts, or they can't find information to support any decision, which was only expressed by two people. So overall, you can kind of see this very interesting picture coming about of how members of parliament use decision making. So they do want to use credible and relevant information, but there's conflicting evidence, conflicting opinions on what counts as research, and there are many challenges related to using science and evidence. And I think the most interesting one is that they can't find it's hard for them to find experts and there isn't enough research in what they need. And it kind of goes to show that perhaps this research is already happening and scientists aren't sharing it widely enough for it to be found. So if I put it all together, we've talked about Canada's science policy landscape, we've taken a look at some of the organizations and individuals involved, we've gotten a better idea of what the decision-making process looks like. So if we synthesize it together, though probably the first important thing is that you want to know who you want to reach. You don't want to reach out to the provincial level of government when really the person who's in charge of deciding how much money is allocated to science is at the federal level. Similarly, you don't want to talk about educational changes when that's a provincial responsibility. There's also this idea of an inside versus outside approach. So yes, you could appeal to policy analysts, to deputy ministers, perhaps going through a formal route by testifying on committees, maybe submitting a policy brief, maybe participating in a budget consultation. Or you could take an outside approach, so signing petitions, open letters, writing op-eds to really appeal to the elected representative who represents you to take action. Going back to the question where we were talking about how science communication differs for policymakers, the person who pointed out actions, that is definitely important. It's definitely time is one of the restraints that we've learned about members of parliament. So having clear and actionable recommendations is important. Synthesizing key findings to shorter format is extremely important because, as we've learned, information overload is a challenge that decision makers are facing. And then the last one that I want to point out is picking your moment. For example, well, last year it would have been a good time to talk about advocating for science in federal elections. But right now we're probably getting closer to another set of federal elections, so this would be a better time to talk about re-elections and who's running for office. Versus climate change is always timely and is probably especially important as we're hopefully getting to the end of this pandemic. So kind of putting it all together, you want to decide who you're targeting, you want to decide on your approach, you want to synthesize your issue into clear, actionable recommendations that's clear what you're asking, and you want to pick the right moments. The last part, we have time. The last part is how can you participate in the science policy interface? And I'm going to take 2 minutes to ask you all these questions. I don't have a Mentimeter link for this, but if you want to drop in the chat any ideas of what you have or what you've done in the past or what you think of when you think of engaging in science policy. So it could be writing an op-ed, it could be protests, open letters, policy briefs. Let me know if you've participated before. Poster session in Parliament? Wait, I need to know more. Did you do this before, Tristan?
Yes, in the Houses of Parliament in the UK, when I was a PhD student, they had a session and young researchers presented posters to the MPs.
Nice. These weren't the usual academic posters, right? They were more fine-tuned for the audience, right?
They were fairly sciencey, yeah. This was a while back, so it was before people really, thought
Mm.
about adapting communications for different audiences as much. Yeah, we were there to try and translate it and explain it to them in a way that they could understand.
Well, that sounds really cool. There's no equivalent that I can think of here in Canada. But there is the Science Meets Parliament program where researchers they receive communications training and then they go and meet with members of parliament. It's restricted to people with a Canada Research Chair Tier 2 position, I want to say, and I think it's in its third or fourth or second year. But posters to parliament, that sounds very fun. Other examples that I see in the chat is iPolitics. So iPolitics is a news outlet, media outlet. Yeah, they're open to editorials, opinion pieces, as well as news pieces, and it's definitely a place to read to learn about what's going on. And there have been some very interesting science-related pieces in there too. Adam has pointed out reaching out to local politicians, so whether that's MPPs at your provincial level, MPs, or senators, to participate in committees that advocate for what you're interested in. And Stefan has pointed out IPCC to inform policy to not prescribe it. So lots of examples. I'm going to start off by perhaps suggesting a few reasons for why to engage in science policy, though I feel like a lot of you are engaged because you're here today. The first one would obviously to make a difference, whether that's related to your particular scientific field or the world of science and policy in general. Another is to explore different fields. So a lot of the research that we're doing has policy implications. So exploring the legal, the ethical, the policy, and the political implications is just as important. It can also be to bring your expertise to decision-making tables. So whether you're a graduate student or a senior investigator, your expertise isn't one that is shared or known at every decision-making table. So what you're seeing as you're analyzing data might not be accessible to everyone. So really participating in committees is just as important. It also helps expand your own understanding of the policy process and allows you to become more involved in the community, especially with your elected representative who is there to hear from you and listen to you. And of course, it's also a chance to address issues in scientific fields through policy, whether that's addressing equity, diversity, inclusion, advocating for more funding towards scientific research, or just trying to improve the policies to help structure science better. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just a couple of the reasons why people do engage in science policy. And my slides are, no, my slides are fine. I'm going to give a few examples, and then before I kind of give you a bigger list of all the ways you can engage in science policy. So one of the most straightforward ones would be to engage with your elected representatives. Here in the slide, you can see a photo of Andy Fillmore, who was the then Liberal Party candidate in September 2019, and he visited the lab of Dr. Paola Marignani to learn more about their research. And that's something you can do. You can reach out to your elected representative, invite them to come hear about the science or the research that you're doing. It's obviously better if it's kind of a one person, if it's just you who's reaching out, perhaps a call, an in-person meeting makes more sense. But if you do have the ability to invite them to your research group or your lab, then yeah, elected representatives will take the time to visit. I think one of the most unique ways I've seen of people engaging with elected representatives was actually by Dr. Amanda Berry, who's here in Toronto, Ontario. She wanted to reach out to Stephen Lecce, the education minister, and she actually reached out by taking a petri dish and writing his name using microbes and tweeting it out. And she had first sent emails and called. But it was this tweet that actually got her representative's attention, and he ended up visiting her lab and speaking to her about scientific research. This was, of course, pre-pandemic, both of them, but it kind of goes to show that if you choose to engage with your elected representative, they are there to hear from you and they will listen and come talk. Another example of engaging with representatives are campaigns. So this here is this campaign that was launched in 2017 called Students for the Report. A little bit of background context. So in 2017, there was a report that was commissioned by the federal government. It was called the Fundamental Science Review. It's sometimes referred to as the Mailer Review. And this report really reviewed the state of science, and it put forward recommendations on how to better support science and what would be needed to improve the state of science in Canada. There were a lot of funding recommendations in this report, funding for trainees, funding for science overall, and just pointing out where Canada has fallen behind when it comes to scientific research. And this particular campaign was trainees getting together to say, we're supporting the report, we're students for the report, and it was led by Science and Policy Exchange. I've grabbed some text from their campaign site, and you kind of see that clear call to action saying that Canada's scientific community has this opportunity to shape the future. We need your help. That this is about federal funding, and why it's important. It's because students who are training are going to be the next generation of scientists. Their actionable item was sign this open letter to be sent to the Prime Minister, and to also tweet and kind of take photos and get the word out there. And it wasn't just that open letter. So this open letter ended up getting 1,200 signatures, and it was also co-signed by a number of associations. So this is an example of a more long-term effort where it takes time to pull together your allies, the people who might support you, figuring out who your decision maker is. So they decided it was Prime Minister Trudeau and the related Minister of Science and Minister of Finance and Minister of Innovation at the time. And they had a very clear task for both people to engage as well as the people who had the power to make a decision. But not everything. Another example of an open letter is the Save Pearl campaign. So this was Evidence for Democracy trying to advocate for the Pearl station to remain open. But not everything has to happen at a national level. There's also things like protests for, this is the Fridays for Future marches that were happening every Friday. And kind of putting it all together, there are so many ways you can engage, and sometimes it really does come down to time. It's whether you kind of have minutes, hours versus days or weeks versus months or years. And just to give you a few examples, again, this is not exhaustive. One would be kind of voting in elections. That's the easiest and fastest way to play a role in the decision-making process. You can participate in budget consultations, and this can vary. This time around, it was a simple survey link where people had to kind of indicate what their priorities were, and you could fill that out and see and kind of express your opinions and views on what's happening. For context, the next federal budget will be announced on April 19th, so we'll see what happens there. Other examples could be signing a petition, attending a protest, attending local events. So you're a member of parliament or you're a member of provincial parliament, maybe hosting events in your local area where you can attend and show up and express your views. You can write an op-ed in your local newspaper to flag what are the issues that you care about and what are the actions that can be taken to address it. Taking some more time, you can also engage with your elected representative, whether that's a call, arranging a lab visit, or reaching out via social media. You can volunteer in the science policy interface. So you could volunteer with groups like Science and Policy Exchange. You could volunteer on the policy committee or the advocacy committee of the scientific organizations you're part of. Or you could even choose to volunteer with a political campaign or political office if you want to get more involved. You can write policy briefs, participate in, participate in committees, work in the policy interface. So you could take a role as a science advisor, you could take a role as a policy analyst, you could apply for something like the MyTax Canadian Science Policy Fellowship to spend a year embedded in a government office, and you could run for office. And yeah, there are honestly so many ways that you could engage. And this is, again, not an exhaustive list, but it kind of gets you thinking about whether you're a trainee or an investigator. There are so many ways to engage, and it really comes down to how much time you're willing to spend on it. And with that, I wanted to turn it over to you. Our activity for today is to get you all to pick an issue that you want to address through the science policy interface. And in terms of the activity, um, I've broken it down to 5 steps. Where the first step is, what issue do you want to address? What action do you want to see taken? So the issue could be something as simple as you want to advocate for increased scientific funding, or perhaps you want to talk about your research with a decision maker. Perhaps you've set up a 5-minute call, or you're going to send an email. And in terms of next steps, it's going to be, you have to identify your target decision maker. Are you going to be approaching a minister, a department? Are you going to be reaching out to your elected representative? Who are your allies, opponents, and stakeholders? What strategy or tool are you going to use? Are you going to write an op-ed? Are you going to give a call? And what is the story? What is the narrative that you're going to use to approach this issue? And specifically taking a second for the allies, opponents, and stakeholders. So one tool that a lot of folks use, and I've adapted this from Change Agency and Evidence for Democracy, is kind of drawing out a power map of the target stakeholders who are involved with your issue. So as you can see, the y-axis is kind of influence and power, with the most influential and powerful at the top. And then on the x-axis, you've got whether people strongly support or oppose. And you can kind of place people differently. For example, let's say we're taking the issue of advocating for science funding. The people who likely very strongly support it are fellow scientists, but they're also the least influential or powerful. So I would put federal scientists probably a little around here. But if you were to kind of put together a group of scientists, so maybe put together a campaign, put together an open letter where you really amass numbers and get a number of signatures, then you might be able to move the influence a little higher. But the most powerful folks who would be slightly supportive, or perhaps in this ambivalent place, would be people like the Minister of Innovation or Industry. They're the ones who can ask for and request increased funding for science in things like the federal budget. So I would put the Minister for Innovation right here. Strongly oppose. Well, the other ministers, so perhaps ministers for economy or other folks who have different portfolios, who, if there's increased funding for science, they would lose out on money. Perhaps they would be on the strongly opposed and most influential side here. I'm trying to think of a least influential and strongly opposed. Well, I suppose if there are folks who are anti-science or who are science hesitant and are very vocal about it, they might show up in this quadrant right here. So that was a very broad, vague example, but that's kind of a way that you can use to put together your target stakeholders. We now have 10 minutes. Pick an issue, think about how you want to approach it. I don't know who's done slide number 8, but I really love it, so I'm going to share that one. The issue that this person wants to address is environmental impact assessment or risk management in Ontario's far north. What action do they want to see taken? They want to see mandatory, rigorous environmental impact assessments before the development of any major infrastructure development and consultation with, I see dash, but I'm going to assume the local community. Identify your target decision maker. So there's the Ministry of Environment, Conservations and Parks, there's the Ministry of Energy, Northern Development and Mines, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. What strategies or tools will you use? So you'll use petitions, protests, op-eds, science policy briefs, media interviews. So full out campaign, I love it. And what is your story? Your story that you've picked, or the narrative that you think is the best fit here, is the far north is a pristine ecosystem and a fragile ecosystem, so any development So any development needs to be properly planned and the risk impacts of development need to be properly assessed. And as for your power map, you've pointed out that conservation authorities are the critical allies or stakeholders in this. Mining companies, prospecting companies, and government leaders may be on the opposition. Citizens who are opposed to barriers to economic development would oppose this, and then scientists and concerned citizens would strongly support. So that's a really interesting one. At the federal level, you've got the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada who tackle any development happening to federal lands. I don't know if something similar exists for provincial lands, but I think the approach that you've taken is very straightforward. Yeah, I would just do some research to double check how provincial lands are currently being managed and if there's kind of a similar model to the federal one. Another example that we can pull is trying to exit here. I feel like this is Tristan because I see a lot of UK examples in this one. I'm going to screen share it. So the issue that this person wants to address is support for embedding public engagement in science funding. The action that you want to see taken is a public commitment by science funders to include requirements of public engagement in all grants, so clear action. Who is your decision maker? The Minister of Science, the heads of Tri-Council funding agencies, heads of non-governmental funders or affiliated organizations. What strategies will you use? Start with building support and awareness of the UK approach among key stakeholders in Canada, and then using op-eds and or advocacy letters from stakeholders to heads of funding agencies. Another way could be is, well, the federal funding agencies are currently putting together their strategic plans, including NSERC, so the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council. They actually have their surveys open. So they're looking for ideas on what the next issues they should be focusing on. So I would actually say take part in the NSERC strategic survey plan so that you can share this very important thing, which I'm pretty sure they should be thinking about. And that's one faster way to definitely get that across. As for your story and key message, public engagement needs to be a clear requirement of funders to incentivize researchers and universities. I don't think you'll find anyone who disagrees with that. But yeah, I would agree that building support and awareness is the first important part. Op-eds are important, but there have been a lot of similar op-eds. Like, this is a shared sentiment. So I think an inside approach might be better for this one, just because you want to actually reach out to the folks who are involved in making a decision and get them started. So now we're going to pass it over to Jesse, who's going to tell us a bit more about science policy, but from a land planning and land use perspective. So thank you for being here, Jesse.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. So thanks everybody. I'll acknowledge that that I'm joining this gathering on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation here in Ottawa. So I'm a community planner. I was born in Calgary, and I'm currently living in Ottawa. And my first exposure to the Arctic, which is where I'll situate this talk, was just after grad school. In November, I flew into Kogloktok Nunavut, which is just above the Arctic Circle, which meant that it was very dark when I arrived, and even darker when my wife arrived just before Christmas. And so I often kind of feel like I was both literally and figuratively in the dark when I began my career in the Arctic, knowing very little about Indigenous peoples of Canada and the northern context that I was working in. And it wasn't until just after Christmas, when the sun finally started to break up over the horizon, that we could start to see the community that we had just committed to living in for the first time. And so I just sort of give that context, and just to sort of situate myself in this work. And I know Marianne and some of the speakers from earlier in these workshops talked about how folks introduce themselves not so much with their academic credentials first, but where you're from and sort of who you're from. And so I thought I would do that today. And I think it's a bit important that we think about where we're positioned when we're approaching Northern Canada or Indigenous communities, and recognizing our outsider status when that's the case. And so that's what I thought I'd start with today. So I've got about 10 years of experience that I'm going to pick and choose from and sort of mine to present you sort of the juiciest bits in this talk. So I spent some time working with the government of Nunavut, crafting policy, municipal planning policy, and I left, and I currently work as a consultant doing the same sort of work from afar. And so that work includes designing subdivisions, evaluating development proposals. So this is folks coming forward saying they want to build things, and me acting as an advisor to municipalities, making decisions about whether or not to allow those proposals to happen. And then also I've had the opportunity to develop guidelines for subdivision design, and I sort of think of these as sort of DIY because what happens in the north is that decisions and projects are undertaken through a wide range of folks who are available, and you're not always bringing in outsiders and experts necessarily in all cases. You're beginning with the resources that you have, and so the guidelines that we end up creating are often for regular folks to make the best use of the materials and knowledge that they have to make decisions in their smaller communities. And so we target and aim a lot of the work that we do at regular folks that don't have necessarily a long academic background or experience in doing the sorts of design work and the sorts of community planning work that we're providing information on. And I think that's sort of a useful framework to think about where your research might hook into policy and might hook into communities, not necessarily aiming at sort of an expert practitioner, but aiming at that really anybody and everybody on the ground who has some capacity and has some interest and has some ability and can be a part of the implementation process for the projects that you want to be involved in. And then I teach community planning, a couple of courses, sort of fall and winter typically. So that's enough about me. You'll notice that what I'm talking about is Northern Canada, and specifically where my work is Nunavut, which is a big piece of Arctic Canada. And so that's where I'll kind of situate this talk, and so I'll talk about sort of some of the regulations and legislation and those sorts of things that you might be involved with if you're doing work in Northern Canada. Of course, there's Northern Quebec and Nunatsiavut and NWT and the Yukon. There's other jurisdictions as well, and so I don't mean to exclude them, but I will be focusing primarily on Nunavut. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I'm using community planning as a lens to talk about science policy as we get going. But I wanted to just open up a poll. And so this is just me trying to get a sense of what your position is relative to research in Nunavut, your research relative to decision making, which is the broad topic. If you'd like to mention your research topic, I don't know, I guess we can't do that in the polls, but if you'd like to type it in chat, or I'd invite you to just unmute yourself and go ahead and speak verbally and talk about what your research topic is, particularly if it relates to permafrost, or particularly if it relates to environmental policy in Northern Canada. That would be very interesting for me to hear as I sort of position the rest of this talk. The results of the first poll up right now, half the folks responding saying that they do impact human settlements. So that's great. That's what I'll be focusing on. I hope that this talk is useful for folks who are not necessarily doing work just in Nunavut or just in permafrost, or even work that impacts human settlements. What I want to provide is one avenue where research enters into policy, and give as many sort of juicy tidbits on how that works as I can. And hopefully you can apply that if you're working with marine ecosystems or some other sort of impact. Do you hope or expect your research will influence policy? So I'm hoping the answer is it's 8 out of 8 here, but maybe there's some folks who are doing really basic research that doesn't impact policy. please do just throw your research topic in the chat if you can. I heard a little bit of what came out of Farah's presentation, which was really cool. Of course, I was particularly noting the individual who talked about recognizing the fragility of ecosystems in the north and wanting development to respond to that. So you're in my mind. If there's anybody else who's working on that sort of thing, please throw it in the chat. I will see your results there. Poll is now up. Do you expect or hope your research will influence policy? Okay, so that's 6 out of 6. So that's great. The next question: can you clearly see implications of your research on decision making? Yeah, this I expect to be a bit of a mixed response, because and that's part of what we want to talk about here. What I'm going to hope to show is how research that could impact, or I guess research that could impact human settlements or could impact built form, has a really clear avenue to influence decision making. That's sort of what I want to get across in this session. So hopefully, it'll become a little bit easier to see some of the ways that research can impact decision making throughout the discussion today. So I'm seeing about a quarter of folks saying that they can see that. Yeah, there we go, and 4 folks not seeing a way for their research to impact decision making. Okay, so that's interesting. Yeah, I'll be interested to see what folks feel at the end. And Jen, I'm seeing it's an interesting question, because at least in my case, the policy implications aren't thought about when the project is being developed. That's really interesting, and like I should be extremely clear and upfront by saying that I am not a researcher, and so I am not here to tell anybody how to do their research. I think that and sort of the thesis of my discussion is going to be that if it's really clear in your mind what the avenues are for your research to influence decision making and influence what happens on the ground and via policy, then it might be easier for you to position your research in a way that it can be better taken up in the way that you hope it will be. So I think that's kind of going to be my thesis, and that's coming from the perspective of a policy maker. So that's somebody who makes policy in response to what's out there. So I'm not sure if policy implications should be on your mind when you're doing your projects. That's sort of for you as researchers to decide on what scale, national, regional, and community. Okay, that's interesting. So I'll be focused mostly on the community scale, but I'll sort of keep in mind that other folks are working at higher levels here. And I think we have just one more poll question. How much do you know about land use planning? Yeah, okay, and it's looking like most folks are pretty unfamiliar. Okay, so hopefully this will be kind of an interesting introduction to how land use planning implements research and the best available data into local decision making. And so, of course, I'm going to evangelize for the planning profession, but I think more broadly, it serves as an example of one vehicle for decision making to take into account research and to sort of demonstrate how that gets operationalized in terms of the structure and the form of communities. So there are certainly other things that could be talked about. Okay, so thanks, Jen, for your comment, and anybody else. I've got the chat open here, so anybody else, throw it in chat if you have any other comments about how you're positioned in this discussion. So we'll be talking about planning as an implementing tool for research. I should explain for a moment what I mean by planning. Planning is broad. What I'm specifically talking about is land use planning, which is concerned with the built environment. So that's looking at how communities physically grow and adapt. So that means we're talking about what buildings get built and what infrastructure is built to provide and service and allow for amenities for those land uses, and then how intensively land is used. So we're really looking at what gets built and what infrastructure is serving that development. And so planning is a regulatory framework as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where the authority comes from for it, and hopefully sort of demystify what the chain of sort of command is in terms of actually producing rules for how the built form evolves. So before I get into that, I just want to talk about a meeting that a session that I put together, which gathered researchers and policymakers to try to ask the question of how we can put research into practice. And I'm going to kind of use some of the lessons from that session to sort of guide our discussion today. So in 2018, I facilitated this workshop with permafrost researchers from across Canada, and we intentionally brought together policymakers and developers into the room. And so we had this cauldron of all of the people who tried to influence each other and try to receive information from each other in the room and see if we could answer the question, how might we better organize ourselves and organize research to have it infuse decision making. And so I'll just pull a couple of things from that. So I pulled folks from across Canada. So you'll see we sort of touched on just about every region. Some of these names might be familiar to you if you're permafrost researchers. And so we use this idea of the development continuum. And I asked, so it includes, I think, six steps or phases in development. And I asked everybody in the room to kind of put themselves in relationship to these phases. And what we found was this, a big jumble that just about everybody kind of wanted to stick their name on twice or three times onto the board. And you can see the interconnected lines and the multiplication of some of these phases, showing that we're really all quite connected. And so what this continuum shows is the process beginning with, and it's continuum for development of communities. It shows that the process begins with community planning, project conception, and then site selection, choosing which ground is suitable for building on. The permitting, that's the regulatory framework, and the design of the buildings or infrastructure, the logistics and actually the construction, and then maintenance. And so that just sort of gives you, that's just one frame for looking at beginning to end what we mean when we talk about actually building, we talk about development. And so what we saw was that we're very interconnected in our work when it comes to building an infrastructure. And this creates an opportunity for researcher at one scale to really reach across the development continuum and impact decision making along that whole continuum. So in this talk, we'll look at decisions that are made throughout the planning system, and I want to try to do two things. One, give you some ideas about ways that you may be able to operationalize your research through the planning system in some of the ways that were recommended here and that came out of this meeting. And then use planning as just one type of policy to give you a real world example of research working its way into policy from the perspective of a policymaker. And so what were we talking about? We're talking about hazard mapping. We're talking about environmental hazards. We're talking about permafrost degradation. I thought I'd just throw up an example where there's a community planning attempt at designing and locating a new subdivision. I think this is an example from Clyde River in Nunavut. And so we're looking at surficial geology, and so there's some mapping around that. We're looking at permafrost features, and so these are some ice formations. And then we zoom in a little bit further, and not zoom in a little bit further, but clarify a little bit further what all of the data is telling us. Now, this is coming from the latest research, as well as some of the engineering analysis. And at the end of this process, we can produce this sort of stoplight map, which is really easily digestible and communicates clearly when it comes to what gets built next, where there are hazards and sort of what needs to be avoided. And so, you can see here, lots 1 and 2 here might be reserved for like a playground and not your largest residential development or something like a large concrete slab on grade. So you might see that there's hazards where we have to build infrastructure like a roadway, and so what engineering standards are going to be required for that road, given the constraints that we know or given the hazards that we know are present in that land. This is just an example of sort of coalescing data in a way that begins as a representation of what the research found and ends as something that can be digested and understood by the planning system, understood by local decision makers who have to make decisions about which lots they lease out to which applicants who want to build which types of development. So having sort of a map like this is sort of one possible end route for some of the research that we looked at in that session. And actually, I just want to make one more. I'm just going to jump back here. So just some of the key takeaways I think are probably pretty obvious from this session, but they'll sort of infuse some of the examples I give next. So key takeaways of how to mobilize knowledge about, in this case, permafrost conditions to mitigate hazards that will permeate local decision making. So some of the key takeaways: understanding what data policymakers are looking for is key. Ensuring that knowledge is transferred to the local councils, recognizing that those are the decision making bodies, and then feed directly into the requirements checklists for development. So recognizing that there's a process for evaluating development and then feeding directly into that process. And then involving end users throughout the process of developing the data and being aware of how those end users plan to use the data. So these were some of the key, and I go through them quickly because I imagine they're already in your head, but some of those, that lens of just recognizing that we need to keep in mind our end user and involve them at the beginning. We need to keep in mind the potential uses for this research and use that to guide the ways that we produce our data products, for example. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about where sort of the authority for planning comes from, and then I'll jump into some examples from my work over the last decade in Nunavut about specifically where we saw research operationalized. The Nunavut Agreement, which is a modern lands claim agreement, which sparked the creation of the Territory of Nunavut 21 years ago, defines what municipal land is. And then the Planning Act, so that's the Territorial Act, at the Nunavut Planning Act, the Territorial Act gives authority to municipalities, so that's the 24 hamlets in Nunavut and the city of Iqaluit, the 25 municipalities in Nunavut. It gives authority to each of those municipal bodies to regulate land use, which is really just talking about development and the intensity of land use within those municipal boundaries for that municipal land. So the big Nunavut Agreement says this is what municipal land is. The Territorial Act says municipalities have the authority to regulate land use for municipal land and administer municipal land. And then to create your own municipal bylaws, which allow you to develop specific rules that are localized to your context for development on those lands. And so those two local level bylaws are, in the case of Nunavut, the community plan and zoning bylaw. If you're in like Ontario, that'll be the general plan and your site plan control. And, there's different names for it in every jurisdiction. So, I mean, the reason I bring this up is just to show that there's a clear path to understanding who has the authority to make the decisions here. In this case, the decisions about what gets approved for development. And next, there's a clear implementation authority. So the territorial ministry, as a branch of the government of Nunavut, is responsible for basically oversight. So there's sort of a second check. But the first check, the first review, and the key sort of decision maker is the municipal councils. And they can delegate some authority to their municipal planning or development officers, but they're municipal staff. So you have a clear sense that the municipalities themselves are responsible for decision making in terms of what gets built. And it's the municipal staff that are making those decisions. So it's really at a very local level, and that's partly through devolution. And as devolution continues, which is happening across Canada and in other countries as well, even more responsibilities will fall to municipalities. So when we're talking about who we're talking about influencing municipal policy. We're talking about influencing and having input into decisions that municipal councils are making. So planning is geographic policy. Targeting the scale is kind of key, and that's why I asked that question at the beginning. To me, the policy gets more and more interesting at smaller scales. It's very, very hard to change high-level policy. It's very hard to change the Planning Act, or in Ontario, the provincial policy statement, or wherever you are. It's very hard to change those high-level policies. They change rarely, and it's very difficult. It's pored over by lawyers. It's a lot easier to change policy at the lower levels, especially at the municipal levels. So I kind of advocate for sort of the medium scale, which is broad enough to allow you to do a lot, but very powerful. And so I'll talk just about those scales quickly, and then we'll get to some examples. So the territorial scale, the Planning Act in Nunavut came from Northwest Territories, from which Nunavut broke off. And that in turn was inherited from Alberta. So it hasn't really been updated in 20 years. Folks are trying to work on that now, but there isn't really any language in the Planning Act about climate change. So you might try to infuse it with something like all municipal plans must include adaptation measures to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So that's the sort of statement you might be able to get into a high-level piece of legislation like that, which would be great. That's sort of a long road, and what you might then see is a minimum level of action that's triggered at municipalities saying, okay, we're required to do this, so we all need to now pass a bylaw that meets the minimum requirement of that Territorial Act. At the municipal level, you'll see statements like council shall undertake a study to evaluate environmental hazards to development, and so this is action that council will initiate. So you can see policy like that, and I'll give an example in the city of Iqaluit of a policy like that. Now that's a lot easier to kick off because these municipal plans are updated every 5 years. They look at a 20-year planning horizon, but they're updated every 5 years, which really gives you an opportunity, a lot more kicks at the can to inject some policy like this, or to encourage decision makers to add in policy like this. And then at the subdivision level, so this is a portion of a community, you might see a policy like building foundations or buildings must be built on piles. So we've identified through our hazard mapping, for example, a particular vulnerability in this part of the community. We need to see that all developments are built on piles, pinned to bedrock, to have confidence that development is going to be feasible here. So that's just sort of an idea of what that tiering can look like and what's possible at those different levels and where it leads to change. Okay, so these municipal plans, so we'll look at planning as a decision-making tool. These tools are these, I'm going to mention a few of these tools now. Official plan, obviously, in Ontario is what we call them. In Nunavut, it's community plan, or in the city of Iqaluit's case, the general plan. So anyway, these are high-level policy documents at the municipal scale, high level, which talk about the objectives and values of the community. And then you'll see underneath them zoning bylaws, which are more fine-grained. They're collections of regulations as opposed to policy, which are really like rules for development, or they're sort of a more specific kind of policy that are rules for development. So like I said, they look ahead 20 years, which also is an opportunity, because if we're talking about things like climate change or talking about the environment, we can encourage folks to consider some of the long-range impacts that might not be apparent now, but because they're updated every 5 years, there's more opportunities to adapt them. And in addition to these regular update periods, they can be amended at any time. It's not an easy process, but they can be an amendment can be initiated at any time by community members. So those are some of the plans. I'll just give an example here. This is, again, from the city of Iqaluit here. We see this is part of their vision framework. So this is a vision statement that, we're a community that adapts to climate change. And then you can see some of the objectives in there to study the impacts of climate change. So this policy can be used to support collaboration with climate scientists and support studies for our climate studies. So I want to talk for a minute about design guidelines. I mentioned earlier, this is the manual that I had a chance to update a couple of years ago. I sort of think of it as like a DIY manual. And so we were asked to update this to include best practices around climate change and climate resilience. And so we drew from the NESE standards, Northern Infrastructure Standards Initiative, something along those lines. I expect the folks in this meeting are far more familiar with that body. But anyway, we drew from the recent standards and recent scientific data that had been gathered together in those standards and recent publications, and brought those into the manual. So this is I just give this as an example. This is one way that scientific knowledge can end up moving closer to decision making. This is not policy per se, but I'll show in a minute how it can sort of be again mobilized. So just a quick example from this design guideline. So when we talk about subdivision design guidelines, we're talking about guides for designers who are opening up, in most cases, new tundra, untouched land to put in roads and houses and other forms of development. So this is putting in infrastructure and then putting in development on those lots. So here we're referencing the NESE standards. And so we pulled from some data that talked about how culverts get clogged longer than 12 meters. If they exceed 12 meters, that they can become clogged, especially just preceding spring melt. This leads to standing water. This leads to further permafrost degradation, which leads to vulnerabilities for building foundations and all the rest of that. And so we responded to that by dropping in standards for maximum culvert length, which then have a whole series of knock-on effects related to subdivision design. So when you limit culvert width, you limit driveway width, you limit the types of backup parking that are allowed. You increase the number of access points on roadways, and all of these kind of impact subdivision design. And so recognizing, so that's sort of us as planners and designers bringing in standards and guidelines and guidance from the research, and then finding opportunities to really embed that in the granular design and decision making around what our subdivisions look like. So that's just sort of an example. I'll just use one more. We just talked in the pre-planning process. So before you do detailed design for a subdivision, where you're sort of selecting your land, you're selecting your sites, to include snow drifting studies, drainage plans, recognizing how important it is not to have standing water and the effect that has on permafrost, surficial geology mapping, and permafrost hazard mapping. So just talking a little bit about and familiarizing local decision makers with these tools and identifying them as a key part of the pre-planning stage. I'll just talk very briefly about a project that I'm working on in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, and I know you heard from Marianne, who spent a lot of time there over the years. So this is the western portion of the municipality. We're looking at about 20 years of future growth. So we sketched out what the sort of the master development plan would look like. We drew from, this is sort of a drainage map we're seeing here. We drew from the best available data that engineers could give us about drainage in the area before development. And so we came up with a conceptual plan, which is great, but we kind of realized, and we kind of knew that this wasn't going to be enough to go into detailed design. And so we did that project over the last couple of years. And then this year, we secured funding from the Climate Change Preparedness for the North Fund to do a bit more rigorous analysis that involves scientists, that involves the youth in the community. So that's this little sort of green blob here in the middle that sort of draws together the youth as well as engineers and scientists to study the area for microclimate and drainage issues, and then all under the guidance of our advisory group, including the Hunters and Trappers Association and elders. So bringing in traditional knowledge as a way of guiding the scientific process. And we intentionally included no travel budget in the funding ask. So there's no Southern specialists flying up to Cambridge Bay. That all of the on the ground analysis will be done by the youth as the eyes and ears for this project. So really getting folks on the ground engaged in the process of gathering the information about landforms and weather events and the performance of the drainage system, the drainage works, and that sort of thing, like spring melt. So that'll all be feeding into the final product, which will guide ultimately the detailed subdivision design to add the detail for this concept plan. So that's just sort of one other avenue where we recognize the value of having that scientific data infused at the key moments in the decision making process about what the detailed design will look like for these future development areas. And so I just sort of encourage you as researchers to sort of look for those opportunities where you can jump into that process, knowing that folks on the ground are always looking for input to enrich detailed design for the growth of their community. Just to get right down to the very brass tacks, what it looks like, what planning looks like when we're talking about planning policy at the operational level is reviewing development proposals. And so on the left of the screen here, I just grabbed a site plan for a development where the applicant is responding to the policy in the general plan that you see on the right. So we're asking about gravel fill because we're interested in disturbances of the tundra, because we understand that impacts permafrost. We're asking about wind flow underneath the buildings because, again, we understand that impacts snow drifting, which then insulates the ground and impacts permafrost. So we're asking for these things in the policy. We receive a plan and we're checking, and these plans are required for every development. We're checking for exactly whether the proposal for what gets built meets our ideals and meets our objectives. And so that's sort of, at the end of the day, how the policy actually influences what gets built. If the plan does not follow the policy, we send comments back and they revise their plan. And that's how we actually change what gets built. But if you're interested, you can have a look at the Nunavut Homeowner's Guide to Permafrost in Nunavut, which is just you'll notice that it pulls from the same sorts of things that we've been talking about, but brings that knowledge, into the finest level decision making at the household level. So I just thought that was really neat as a way to kind of show that policy can infuse decision making at a variety of different levels when it's communicated well and when it's communicated with the end user in mind. But thanks again so much for your attention and the opportunity to speak about this topic.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to point out that we've now wrapped up the Science Policy 101 workshop, where we've talked about Canada's science policy landscape and different aspects of the decision-making process. This brings an end to our 7 workshop-long programs. So we've talked about Science Communication 101, Social Media 101, then different aspects of public engagement, visual science communication, community engagement, Wikipedia editing, and now science policy. On behalf of everyone involved in programs, so that's Dr. Tristan McLean, Dr. Alana Wilcox, me, and a lot of the folks who helped provide support, including Shirley McKay and Stephen Gruber, and our guest speakers like Jesse, Marianne, Julia Kralik, and so many more. Thank you all for attending our program, and thank you for participating, for learning a little bit more about science communication. I think it's probably very important right now to note that this program was supported by NSERC's Science Communication Skills Grant. That's how we were able to host this program and invite so many incredible speakers in today. Thank you all for tuning in. It's been a really interesting 3 months.